Hi guys, School here and welcome to another Derail Valley Simulator video. On this one, we're going to focus on one of the new locomotives in Derail Valley Simulator, which is this, the DH4. The DH4 is a 4-axle diesel hydraulic locomotive. What does that mean? How does this loco produce propulsion? Let's find out. So the DH4 has a diesel internal combustion engine, and that's what produces the power. But how does the power get down to the wheels? Well, the diesel engine is connected via a hydraulic transmission, hence the term diesel hydraulic. How does that actually work? Well, the hydraulic transmission is basically a torque converter. In the case of the DH4, it actually has 3 torque converters. But what exactly is a torque converter and how does it work? Well, let's get us started up first, and then we'll discuss. Right, so welcome to the cab of the DH4. It's proper old school, isn't it? Isn't it lovely? Right, okay, so let's start back here. So the handbrake is on, it's here. This is the circuit breaker, such that it is. There's only 2, the electrics and the starter. So we'll pop both of those on. Then we come down to here, and we can see that it has a starter button and a fuel cutoff. So bit of a strange position because you could accidentally press one instead of the other, but hey-ho, you hold the start button down and you'll see a few things happen. We'll come back to this dial in a second, but briefly, you've got the sand, the fuel, and the oil levels. You've then got the oil temperature. Again, we'll discuss that in a second. And then we discussed the brake pipe and the main reservoir in the braking video. So over here, we'll pop the cab lights on so we can see what we're doing. We'll put 1 stage of forward and 1 stage of backward lights, wipers we don't need, and sander we don't need. There's also the speedometer. That's how we get it started. Basic controls, we have the independent brake over here, and we have the train brake over here. Down here we have the throttle and reverser, and then we also have the dynamic brake, which we'll cover in a second. Finally, down here we have a wheel slip light. If we get in a wheel slip, the brake pipe pressure is built up, but you know the light's flashing because the handbrake's on, so we'll turn that off. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so let's discuss how a torque converter works. Okay, so in order to understand what these 2 dials are telling you and how to drive this locomotive, we need to understand what the torque converter is. So the torque converter basically uses fluid to transmit the rotating mechanical power of the engine to the drive wheels. It's an enclosed device. At one end is an impeller pump. That impeller pump is spun or driven by the engine. At the other end is a turbine, which is like a big fan, and that drives the wheels. And in between is fluid, and fluid connects to 2. So when you operate this throttle here, it will cause the engine RPM to rise, and the engine RPM is shown here by the white needle. Is currently idling. If you then engage the reverser, that will then cause that pump to start spinning. So the engine will start to turn the pump. When it turns the pump, it starts to spin the fluid inside the torque converter, and the spinning of the fluid then starts to press up against the turbine and spin that, which causes the wheels to turn. Hopefully that made some sense. So what that means is the engine and the wheels are not directly mechanically linked. They're linked by this fluid, but it also means that the engine runs independently of the wheels, and therefore the engine can't stall. What this needle down here shows you is the engine RPM, or how quickly you're spinning the engine. So if the reverse is engaged, how quickly you're spinning the fluid in the torque converter. And then at the other side of that torque converter is how quickly the turbine is now spinning that's trying to drive the wheels. Now normally the white one will be ahead of the red one because the engine's trying to spin the fluid, and this thing will be trying to catch up via the fluid spin. So what we'll do is we'll have a quick demonstration. We'll release the brakes and I've already engaged the reverser. So I'll put the throttle, let me just sit back so you can see all of what's going on here. We'll bring the throttle back into the first position. You can watch the engine RPM will start to rise, And then what you'll see is the turbine try and catch up. And as it tries to catch up, it will be spinning the wheels. Don't forget the red is connected to the wheels. So we'll pin that back. Up goes the RPM. And notice the turbine speed is starting to rise as it tries to catch up to the speed of the spinning fluid, which is driven by the engine. Equally, if we press it a bit more, it will try to spin up a bit more, and then we'll just back off. And now the wheels are spinning and the fluid is spinning. The wheels will never quite catch up with the engine RPM usually, but that's like the basics of how it works. So let's just hit the brakes here. So we'll put this into reverse. And we'll start to do the same thing. I'll release the brake. Now, even though we're going reverse, the principles are all the same. The engine RPM, the turbine RPM, it's all the same. It's still spinning the fluid inside the torque converter. What we're going to do is we're going to reverse back here, and we'll attach to some cars, and then I'll show you what it's like when it's driving under load. Now, the important thing to understand is that the higher the difference between these two needles, in other words, at the end of the torque converter, the fluid is spinning that quickly, and at the other end it's spinning that quickly. The bigger the difference, the greater the fluid friction inside the torque converter, and the more rapidly heat will be generated. Now, due to some kind of weird fluid dynamics, when the wheels are going quite slowly and the engine RPMs start to increase, what the torque converter actually does is increase its torque output. It's like I say, it's all fluid dynamic shenanigans, which you don't need to worry about. But the bottom line is that this thing is like this weird automatic gear. Oops. We need to go back in there and shove it back a little bit. I seem to have bounced. So yeah, when this thing starts to move, it actually increases its torque amount inside the torque converter, so it has more pulling power. So the heavier the load, the more torque it starts to generate. But because of the big difference between those needles, it also starts to generate a lot of heat. And what that means for you as an operator, practically speaking, if I can just flick that and flick that, is that you have to keep your eye on the heat that's being generated by the fluid inside the torque converter, because if the temperature gets high enough, you'll actually destroy the torque converter, and that will be very expensive indeed. So, once the brakes are released, we shall head out. Okay, brakes are released. We'll put the reverser into the forward position. I'm going to throttle it up, and I'm going to throttle it up quite a bit. And what I want you to pay attention to is how high the engine RPMs start to get relative to this. This will take a while to come up now because we've got a lot of load behind us, so it's going to take a lot of time to spin the wheels and thus the turbine. But the engine RPMs are going to increase rapidly, and they're going to produce a lot of torque. But watch that temperature needle start to climb. There we go. So high temperature is being generated very quickly. Imagine if you're going up a hill, it won't take a long time for this thing to start to heat up. So you'll have to govern how much throttle you give it, just like any hill climb, because your transmission fluid, the fluid inside the torque converter, will start to generate a lot of heat when there's a big difference between those two needles. And that is basically how you operate the diesel hydraulic. Now, I mentioned earlier that the DH4 has a dynamic brake. Like most dynamic brakes, it's not that effective at low speeds, but it can greatly assist you trying to control your speed on a long descent, such as what we're coming up to now. And the way it works is quite simple. First of all, you remove all your throttle. Second thing is you make sure your reverse is going in the direction of your travel. And the next thing that you do is engage the dynamic brake. So you'll see our speed here is starting to pick up as we go down this descent. So I'll operate the dynamic brake. There's a few stages you can go through, but I'll just put it on max just to show you what happens. Pay attention to the temperature needle, which is starting to rise. It generates heat when we do this, but you'll see that light come on shortly when the cooling fan activates. So whether you're generating heat because you're operating the engine, or whether you're generating heat because you're using the dynamic brake, the cooling fan will help to keep your temperature under control. But obviously there are limits. How does this dynamic brake work? Well, what actually happens, it's a bit technical, but it modifies the structure of the coupling in the torque converter so that it basically shrinks the fluid housing volume, which introduces extra friction to the fluid that's trying to move inside. And that fluid, the friction slows the wheels down, but that generates a lot of heat, and that heat, you can see, dissipates here. If you're wondering where the fan is, it's actually on the bonnet there, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't actually spin when you look at it. But you can see it's pretty effective. So that's the dynamic brake. Just don't forget to turn it off when you want to carry on. I mentioned earlier that the DH4 actually has 3 torque converters, so how do you use them? What are they used for? Well, each of them effectively are like big gears. They have different ratios. So the way that you operate them is actually quite interesting. There's no switch or lever in here to operate the torque converters and change one to the other. It's all automated. It's quite clever, actually. So what we'll do is we shall start by, let me get rid of the controls here. We'll put the reverser into forward, and we shall basically throttle up. But what I want you to do is look at the white needle. So the white needle rises, it's using the first torque converter. The wheels are starting to catch up. Notice that drop, and then a rise again. That's like a gear shift. That's basically it moving from the first torque converter to the second. And if you watch again, it does the same again. So that's now using the third torque converter. This happens automatically as speed picks up. You can see we're already doing 60 k's. There's nothing after the third one, so the maximum speed is dictated by the ratio of that third torque converter. But you can see we're already doing 70, which in Derail Valley is absolutely plenty. But that makes this thing easy to drive. There's no gears to worry about. All you've got to do is throttle up and pay attention to the temperatures. Really nice to drive this thing. Now, you may also be wondering, when we're travelling at speed, what happens if we back off on the throttle? What happens to those needles? Well, we'll just back off before we overheat the engine. And you can see the white needle at the bottom here, which is the engine RPM, is now lower than the turbine's RPM. Remember, the fluid is still spinning, so the engine RPM can't fully come back down to its normal idle of about 600. But equally, the turbine RPM is slowly coming back as the vehicle slows down. They always try and stay together, but they never actually quite manage to achieve it. So, in summary, the DH4 is in fact a really fun locomotive to drive. It's available in the game at $50,000 license, which basically is more than the DM3. The DM3 is what we'll look at next. The DM3 costs $30,000, but it's more complicated to drive the DM3. For $50,000, this is now a great intermediate step between the DE2 and the DE6. This thing is simple to operate, fairly easy to understand, and it's a lot of fun to drive. That is the DH4. Hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Give me a thumbs up if you did. Until the next one, happy training.